You are about to embark upon the great crusade towards which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Those are the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander on the eve of the D-Day landings. And the D-Day landings are going to be the topic of the debut episode of an exciting new podcast series, Ancient to Recent. In this series, we're going to be deep diving into the events of the past and seeing how they shaped the world of today. We're going to be challenging a few myths, bursting a few bubbles, looking at things from a different perspective, and giving a voice to those who for too long have had their stories overlooked and underappreciated. New episodes of Ancient to Recent will be available every Friday. You can find us on Spotify at Ancient to Recent, or you can click on the link on my Instagram bio to take you to the various places where the podcast will be hosted. Now let's turn our attention to D-Day, the 6th of June 1944. Let's set the stage. Let's see where we're at in the events of the Second World War. The Second World War begins the 1st of September 1939 when Germany invades Poland in alliance with the Soviet Union. Over the next few months, Germany overruns Poland, quickly conquers Denmark, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and surges into the north of France, pushing the British and French back, forcing the British to abandon France and leaving the French to fight for themselves. France is then quickly defeated and surrenders to Nazi occupation. The war rages on in North Africa and in the Atlantic, also over the skies of Britain. But in 1941, Germany turns on its former ally, the Soviet Union, and invades the USSR. The Germans drive deep into Soviet territory towards Leningrad, into the Ukraine, towards Moscow. But at the end of 1941, as the Russian winter sets in, the German assault runs out of steam and the Germans are finally forced back before the gates of Moscow. At the end of 1941, Germany also declares war on the United States of America. Pearl Harbor is attacked by the Japanese, and Germany, as an ally of Japan, declares war as well. If you think about it from the German perspective, why would you do this? You have to remember that the Germans were Nazis. And if you think how Nazis actually saw the world, whereby strength is a product of racial purity, the Nazis believe the Germans are the master race because of their supposed ethnic purity. To fight a country like the United States of America, which is by its definition a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, seemed easy. I mean, there was nothing that they feared about a country that was so ethnically mixed, because to believe that a country like the United States of America could seriously pose a major challenge to Germany was to question the very tenets of Nazi ideology. So if you're at war with the largest empire in the world, the biggest country in the world, you might as well declare war on the largest economy in the world, because if you're in for a penny, I suppose you're in for a pound. The Germans inflict enormous casualties on the Soviet Union, but they also take considerable casualties themselves. For the first time, the German army begins being really ground down. The German army bleeds to death on the battlefields of the Eastern Front. But the cost to the Soviet Union is astronomical. 27 million Soviet citizens would die fighting Germany in the Second World War. And so the Soviets place immense pressure on the Western Allies to get into the fighting. By this point, 1942, 1943, the Soviets have inflicted the first really major defeats upon the German army. The German army has been ground down, but it suffers a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, where Army Group South is smashed. The Allied leaders, the big three, Roosevelt for the United States of America, Churchill for Great Britain, and Stalin for the Soviet Union, they meet in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and the Soviets put pressure on the Western Allies to open up a Western front. The British and the Americans have defeated the Germans and the Italians in North Africa. They have invaded Sicily. They have invaded the Italian mainland. They have begun the process of advancing up the Italian mainland. and Italy has changed sides at this point, but still, the Italian peninsula is really a peripheral theatre of operation. When you compare the battles that are happening in Italy to the sheer scale of fighting that is going on the Eastern Front, it is pretty small beer. And it's for that reason that the Western Allies begin the process of planning the invasion of Western Europe that would come to be known as Operation Overlord. Now, by 1943, the Germans were very aware that the war was turning against them. The German generals, they could read a map. They knew that the days of easy victories and sweeping panzer charges were over. They could see that the Reich was being contracted on all sides. And they also knew that it was only a matter of time before a Western front was opened. For this reason, Erwin Rommel was put in charge of constructing something called the Atlantic Wall, a series of defences that would run from the Pyrenees on the border between Spain and France all the way up to the Arctic Circle in Norway. The Germans knew that the Allies were coming, but they just had no way of knowing where that would be. The Germans were already experiencing very, very considerable manpower shortages by 1944. Literally millions of German soldiers had been killed by this point in the war. The German army simply was not, in June 1944, the effective fighting machine that it had been in 1941, 1940, or even 1942. So Rommel needed to husband his resources very, very carefully. But let's look at those resources. For many years after the conquest of France, France hadn't really seen a lot of fighting. The vast majority of the concentrations of the best units of the Wehrmacht were deployed on the Eastern Front, where the really, really heavy fighting was being done against the Soviet Union. So France was used by the Germans as a combination of a training ground, a dumping ground, and a holiday camp for units that were believed to be too exhausted, too wounded, too old, too young, or too untrustworthy to actually be put in serious combat. So you would have units of troops who literally were the latest draft, the 17, 18, 19-year-old kids just out of school who are being put in uniform and are given 3 weeks training, shown how to assemble and disassemble a rifle, dig a trench, read a map, etc., etc. You know, given a bit of experience, they get to walk around, play soldier for a little bit to kind of bring their confidence up before they're actually shipped off to fight the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Or alternately, you have units who've had really, really heavy fighting, taken really bad casualties. Some of them are really seriously injured, but because the sheer weight of the manpower crisis that Germany's experiencing, you know, these guys can still, you know, man a machine gun nests, you know, use a pair of binoculars, stare out at the ocean a little bit, use a telephone, etc., etc. So you really can't be sending them back home. You need to keep using them. And then there are what are called the Ost battalions. So the Ost battalions are comprised of non-Germans, specifically of Germans from Eastern Europe. So great was the manpower crisis of the German army that they started to recruit people from the ethnic groups that Nazism states are inferior. They started to recruit vast numbers of Poles and Russians and Ukrainians and Latvians and Lithuanians into the German army. Now, some of these soldiers volunteered, but a lot of them kind of did it because there really was no alternative. The experience of being a slave labourer in a German concentration camp was pretty unpleasant. But of course, what would these soldiers actually be fighting for? Like, they're not exactly highly motivated to fight and die for the Führer. Let's take, for example, Alois Damski. He was a Polish man who was working in a munition factory in Poland when he was told to go to the office of his manager, who informed him that as he was a sort of young man in his early 20s, physically strapping, that he was being given an exciting opportunity, which was to stop working in a munitions factory and join the army of the country that had invaded his country and started a war in which his father had been killed in. It was also explained to him that if he didn't, quote unquote, volunteer to join the Wehrmacht, that there would be some fairly unpleasant consequences. So he did what a lot of people did because they had no alternative. He agreed to sign on, and he was deployed to be one of the many non-German soldiers who would end up fighting against the Allies on D-Day. And to look at the sheer diversity of the German army is remarkable. There are Czechs and Poles and Slovaks and Slovenes. There are even Koreans, Mongolians and Indians that would be fighting against British, Canadian and American troops on the beaches of Normandy. Now, there were certain sensitive points around the Atlantic Wall that had indeed been fortified, places like Cherbourg or the Pas de Calais, but a lot of it really was pretty unprepared when Rommel took over in December 1943. There were vast stretches of beaches and fields that really had nothing. So Rommel began the frantic process of fortifying these areas, laying down fields of landmines and reams of barbed wire, tank traps, anti-landing craft devices were laid out in huge numbers. But he's in a race against time. He starts in December 1943, the Allies land the beginning of June 1944, and you've got 2,000 miles to cover. And also there's such a huge, not just manpower, but materiel shortage. I mean, the Western Front is pretty neglected. All the major resources goes to the Eastern Front. So one example of the shortages that Rommel is actually facing is they don't have enough landmines. So one of the innovative ways that the Germans try and get around this is they literally stick a sign in a field that says Achtung mines, scatter bits of scrap metal around the field just to confuse the Allied troops and hope that, well, that'll do, really. However, as the months go by, the fortifications do become much more knitted together. It's not just individual strong points. There starts to form this sort of skeleton, the outer shell. It's not anywhere near prepared, but it's not nothing. It's going to pose a considerable challenge to the Allies. There are further challenges that Rommel will face, and one of them is an Austrian painter and decorator called Adolf Hitler. You see, earlier in the war, Hitler had not really spent much time interfering in actually the day-to-day combat operations of the German army. He had set the grand strategy, and he had then basically said, listen, you guys, you go off, you do it. But as the war had gone on, and as things had got worse and worse and worse for the Germans as a result of his decisions, he came to the opposite conclusion that a rational person would come to, which is, it's not me that's making all these unreasonable demands of the German armed forces, it's the German armed forces not following out my orders. And so one of the things that really distinguished the German army in the early days of the Second World War, its flexibility, the ability of its officers to show initiative, to make decisions for themselves based on the information that they had ahead of them, the understanding of the German High Command that, sure, you can set objectives, but as long as those objectives are achieved, we don't care how they're done. That is stripped away from, that autonomy is stripped away from German officers in the field. And now everything has to be run past Hitler back in Germany. A guy who is 1,000 miles away, who doesn't actually know what's really going on, who doesn't actually have the information available to them, is now going to be the person who's going to be making the on-field battlefield decisions. And this especially pertains to the deployment of the panzer divisions. So there's a disagreement between Rommel and his superior officer, which is Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt wants to hold the panzer divisions back away from the beaches. He wants to use them as a mobile defence so that when they land, wherever they land, they can get there relatively quickly. Rommel, on the other hand, is convinced that the defence of Europe is going to be a success or a failure on the beaches themselves. And he believes what we need to do is we need to have our tanks as close to the beaches as physically possible. Otherwise, it's not going to matter. The deciding factor in German or Allied victory or defeat on D-Day is going to be who's able to build up a critical mass of firepower on those beaches more quickly. Is it going to be the Germans or is it going to be the Allies? The longer the fighting goes on, the more firepower the Allies are going to be able to bring, so the Germans need to meet any landing as quickly as they possibly can. Any delay will be fatal for them. But because autonomy has now been stripped away from the German commanders actually in the field, in order for Rommel to make these decisions, instead of him being able to just go, right, go do it to his subordinates, he's going to need to call Hitler, wherever Hitler is, get his approval, and if Hitler doesn't agree with him, he can't do anything. To compound this, the Allies are engaging in a sophisticated campaign of deception. They are trying to convince the German intelligence services, the German High Command, that the Allies are about to land literally just about everywhere that isn't Normandy. So there's a number of things that the Allies do. First of all, there are German agents in Britain. Some of them are double agents. Some of them have been discovered, but without the Allies, without them themselves realizing that their cover has been blown. And so what the Allies do is they feed them information that they know will then go back to the German High Command saying, yes, it's Calais. The Allies are definitely going to land in Calais. Make sure for Calais. And Calais is the logical place for an invasion. It's the shortest jump between Britain and France. Another thing that the Allies do is they know that the Germans are still flying operations over Britain. The days of the Blitz may be in the past, but there's still the odd Messerschmitt that wanders over. So the Allies build a massive fake army around Dover. Inflatable tanks, fake tents, the whole thing, to make sure they might as well hold up a massive neon sign that says Allied Invasion Force, to make sure that any Luftwaffe pilot who just happens to be wandering around the south of England looks down and sees near Dover a ginormous Allied army. So every time these guys go back, they land back in France and they report in with the Luftwaffe, they say, yes, there's a ginormous army in Dover. Now let's talk a little bit about air power. So earlier in the war, one of the things that had made the Germans so incredibly successful was their ability to integrate, to effectively combine the operations of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, with the Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces. But just like the Wehrmacht no longer being the force it previously had been, if the Wehrmacht was in a bad state by 1944, the Luftwaffe basically didn't really exist. Not only had the Luftwaffe suffered massive casualties, but the acute shortages in trained pilots and in fuel played an even more crucial role in diminishing the Luftwaffe. By 1944, despite a massive campaign of bombing Germany's industrial centres, German armaments production had actually increased throughout the war. However, the German Air Force lacked two things. The first thing it lacked was trained and experienced pilots. The second thing it lacked was oil. The only really reliable supply of oil that the Germans were actually able to draw upon was the wells in Romania. The whole campaign in North Africa had been about getting to Iraq, the Middle East, and the supplies of oil. And the reason that the German army had prioritized surging into the south of the Soviet Union, Case Blue, in 1942, which led to the Battle of Stalingrad, was the desire to get to the Caucasus and the Soviet supplies of oil. But they had lost in both of those cases. So the German Air Force did not have a considerable amount of oil that it could really call upon. And the German Air Force really was the neglected child of the various branches of the German armed forces. The lion's share of the small amount of fuel that the Germans did actually have available to them went to making sure that the panzers could keep rolling. And the Luftwaffe, they basically just got whatever was left over. And so this was such an acute problem by 1944. The scarcity of oil was such a significant challenge for them that the Luftwaffe had started to introduce a major program of rationing. And so great was the rationing that from now on, German pilots, newly trained German pilots, were only allowed to actually fly their planes when they were on combat operations. So if you were drafted into the Luftwaffe, you would basically study theory in a classroom, and then the first time you'd really get into your aeroplane to actually see what the actual experience of flying a Messerschmitt or a Henkel was really like was when you were being shot at by British or American or Canadian or Soviet pilots. And so these two problems then kind of compounded each other. A lack of oil meant you couldn't do training to get experienced pilots, and therefore, because you aren't able to have properly trained pilots, that then compounds your inexperience, because these pilots are getting into their planes, flying for the first time into combat, where they are encountering British, Canadian, American pilots who are able to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours flying and training in their aeroplanes. And so it means that German pilots, who by this point many of them are basically 18, 19-year-old kids, are coming up against vastly better armed and better trained pilots and are then being killed. It's essentially a massacre of the German Air Force, which again has never had more aeroplanes by 1944 than it had at any part in the war. But you can have all the aeroplanes if you want. If your pilots are really inexperienced and they don't actually have any fuel to fly, it's essentially useless. This lack of fuel would allow the Allies total aerial superiority in those crucial early moments on D-Day. It would mean that Allied troops were able to call again and again and again on air power to allow them to dislodge German defensive positions. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, the air forces of the Allies flew thousands of sorties, striking any target in the north of France, Belgium, the Netherlands that could facilitate the transportation of German troops to the front lines. Bridges, railway stations, rail lines, anything that German troops could move along, they struck it. They hit it, and they hit it again to make sure it was absolutely out of action. The hope was that the combined efforts of air power and the paratroopers would buy enough time for the beach landings to be a success, build up a critical mass, and achieve victory on the beaches of Normandy. Now, let's look at the Allied plan for Normandy. The Allies had identified 5 beaches: Juno for the Canadians, Gold and Sword for the British, Omaha and Utah. These amphibious landings were to be coordinated with parachute drops that were to occur the night before. The objective of the paratroopers was to take strategically important positions, bridges, roadhouses, etc., that would allow them to interrupt the flow of reinforcements to the beaches. Now, these soldiers would be dropping into Normandy lightly armed and dispersed over quite a wide area, and they would have to hold on their own in the dark without heavy weaponry, fighting off German reinforcements rushing to the beaches in the hope that the troops on the beaches would take their positions and would be able to come and link up with them. This is really half a suicide mission, because if you think about it from the perspective of the troops on the beaches, if it does go wrong, they can be evacuated. Even if it's messy and horrific and a disaster, they can still be evacuated. But for the paratroopers, they don't have that option. This is either a one-way journey or it's victory and it's nothing else. As they were working to such a tight time frame, the Allies had built up a ginormous logistical capacity to make sure that they could get the troops on the beach, off the beach, and the next wave coming in behind as quickly as possible. So they faced major challenges such as providing fuel. You know, in the early days, in the early waves of the landing, there are going to be tanks. The Allies had designed something called a DD tank, which was essentially just a normal tank that had rubber dinghies on the outside of it, and the idea was that you could just launch it into the ocean and it would just float to the front. They were going to need to have fuel for these tanks. They were also going to need to unload heavier equipment, artillery, the next wave of infantry, huge stocks of food and ammunition and tents, etc. So the Allies addressed this challenge in an incredibly innovative manner. They developed an undersea pipeline that would allow them to be able to pipe directly onto the beaches of Normandy fuel to resupply the tanks. And they also constructed something called a Mulberry Harbour. They weren't going to be taking a harbour. They weren't landing at Cherbourg. So they weren't going to be able to offload really, really big ships. So what they created was this Mulberry Harbour, which was a floating harbour that they could carry through the English Channel to basically dock with the beaches of Normandy, and that would allow bigger ships to land and unload ever-increasing quantities of supplies and troops to force the momentum forward and push the Germans back and win the Battle of D-Day. Now, the Allies had had years to prepare for this operation. The troops had been trained and drilled over and over again. And the Allies had even actually carried out a rehearsal for the landings on D-Day at a place called Slapton Sands, which had ended tragically in a friendly fire incident where hundreds of people were killed. But for all of the training and all of the preparation that the Allies had undertaken, there was one thing that they had no control over. They had no control over the weather. Now, Normandy is a notoriously cold, wet, windy, rainy place, and that comes from an Englishman. The English Channel is an incredibly choppy and turbulent body of water. If the weather didn't cooperate, then it didn't matter what they had planned. They couldn't go ahead. And they also knew that time was against them. They knew that the Atlantic War wasn't what the Germans wanted it to be, but they knew that the Germans were also frantically working to enhance it, to fortify it, to strengthen it in every way they possibly could. And every week that went by was more time the Germans would spend strengthening their position. There had to be a number of unique meteorological factors that combined at the same time. For the paratroopers, they needed low wind and a clear sky. The planes had to be able to see where to go to get to their targets to drop the paratroopers. At the same time, this had to be combined with a low tide so that the troops could land on the beaches short of the main obstacles instead of running straight into them straight away. And then these needed to be combined at the same time that the sun would then rise quickly after that, so that way the troops who are on the beaches and the paratroopers who are behind the lines can then quickly call upon fire support from the Navy and from the Air Force. The Allies spent a huge amount of time studying wind patterns and getting advanced warnings on changing in tide and weather. The original day for D-Day was actually the 5th of June, but it had been called off because the weather was actually too bad. With the Allied High Command knowing that every single day counted, the window for them launching this operation was incredibly short. The German defences were improving, and of course, you're trying to keep quiet a 2 million man army. Eventually, the Germans will find out that you are massing a ginormous army ready for Normandy. So they had an incredibly short window by which they could go. The Allied commanders, after cancelling the 5th of June, had a meeting in which they agonised over whether to go. If this doesn't work out, this is going to be a catastrophe. Thousands and thousands of troops are going to die. But ultimately, they have to gamble. They have to roll the dice. And so Eisenhower calls a meeting, and at 4:15, the morning of the 6th of June, he decides, we're going to have to go. Now is the time, we've got to go for it. Now, the Germans are also reading the weather patterns. Because the weather looks bad that week, they assume that there's no possible way that the Allies can carry out their landings. So many of the senior German commanders are not actually present at D-Day when the landings happen. Many of them have gone back to Paris. Many of them, in the case of Rommel, the supreme commander of the German forces, the man ultimately responsible for meeting the landings, where was he? He was in Germany. He was 1,000 miles away. He was planning a surprise birthday party for his wife. He had bought her a pair of shoes in a shop in Paris. The Allies know that this is a huge risk. They need the cooperation of not just Mars, but Poseidon too. And for all of the huge technological and logistical advantages they have, they know that the odds are still against them. They are trying something that really has never, ever been done before. No, never in the history of warfare has something of this complexity and this scale ever been attempted. On the morning of the 6th of June, the word goes out to hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers to prepare themselves. This is it. This is not a drill. This is not a training exercise. This is the moment that they have been waiting for. They are going to fall from the skies. They are going to wade ashore on the beaches. They are going to smash the forces of Nazi Germany. And they're going to begin the liberation of an entire continent from the unimaginable forces of wickedness and barbarism. Many of them will never come back. Many of them will pay the ultimate price, will make the ultimate sacrifice for the liberation of an entire continent. They say goodbye to their friends, they write a final letter home to their loved ones, they sign their insurance policies, they climb aboard the gliders and the airships, they scramble aboard the landing crafts. They have trained and prepared themselves physically, mentally, psychologically, again and again, years for this final moment. And it is here. It has arrived. D-Day. The paratroopers will be first in. Their planes soar above the English Channel over the coast of France. France appears beneath them, so peaceful and calm and quiet. The pilots of the transport planes tend to be less experienced than the fighter pilots. They keep a tight formation as they ascend over Normandy. They have specific targets that they need to drop their precious crew over. At first they don't encounter any opposition, but then as they get closer and closer, the sky lights up with vast streams of anti-aircraft fire exploding all around them. Some of the pilots panic, break formation, dive deep, pull up high. Some of them see the first of the planes being struck, exploding. The American troop transport planes have a particular quirk whereby the fuel tankers are not sealed off. So in the event of them being struck by an anti-aircraft weapon, they tend to explode and engulf the whole plane in flames. Paratroopers are looking out the window, seeing the arcing anti-aircraft fire ripping through the skies and seeing other aeroplanes blowing up, exploding into flames, seeing the doors being flung open and their comrades flying out on fire, seeing the other planes panicking, careering off in different directions, some of them in sheer terror pull into the path of other planes that collide with each other, explode in midair. Some of them catch fire and plunge into the ground, crashing into the earth. Some of the planes speed up too quickly. At this speed, they won't be able to drop their paratroopers in the right direction. Some of them panic and just order their paratroopers to go too quickly. Some of them pulling up and then release the paratroopers directly into the path of other oncoming planes and straight into the propeller blades. The paratroopers, overloaded with vast quantities of munitions, fall from the skies, gliding down. Overloaded with supplies and equipment, they land in fields flooded by the Germans, and unable to free themselves from their parachutes, they drown. Some of them land on the headquarters of German army units that had been partying and were drunk, and immediately find themselves in combat. Out of the initial moments of fear and anarchy and terror, the paratroopers begin to organise themselves into small combat units and advance on the objectives that they need to take. They know they're up against an incredibly tight timeline. They know that German reinforcements will already be rallying and heading to the beaches. They know that they are alone, that if the landings are not a success, that they are doomed. The first Allied objective, Pegasus Bridge, is secured by the British 6th Airborne Division. 6 gliders of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry crash land within metres of the bridge just after midnight. Led by Major John Howard, the force captures the bridge in a 10-minute assault, surprising totally the German guards and overwhelming them before they could destroy the bridge. They would play a crucial role in holding up German reinforcements rushing to meet the British at Sword Beach. At the same time, the US 82nd Airborne Division secured the town of Sainte-Mère-Église. Parachuters dropped under poor visibility and heavy flak fire, some landing directly in the village. The burning buildings illuminate their parachutes, allowing the Germans to shoot them directly out of the sky. Despite the confusion and bloodshed, Sainte-Mère-Église is the first town liberated in all of France from Nazi tyranny. In the Channel, Allied battleships pour volley after volley of highly explosive shells into the German defences. Allied fighters and bombers swoop down, strafing and bombing anything that could be an obstacle to the first wave of Allied landing craft that are now making their way through the heavy surf onto the beaches of Normandy. Some of the beaches are lightly defended. Some of the troops land fairly easily, but it's a different story, especially at Omaha. Some of the troop transports panic and they lower their doors too far out, leading to American troops jumping into the heavy surf. Way down, they sink immediately beneath the waves. Some of the DD tanks, the tanks with the flotation devices around the side, are lowered into the water far too far out. Their crews sealed inside, they sink immediately beneath the waves. One unit with 29 DD tanks sees 27 of them disappear beneath the surf. At Gold Beach, British forces push inland. At Juno, Canadians face stiff resistance and heavy casualties, but their discipline and determination allows them to overcome any obstacles. And the first wave sent in was special operators with radio equipment designed, trained specifically to help them coordinate the advance of the infantry with fire support from the Navy and the Air Force. This allows the Allied troops gradually, pillbox by pillbox, obstacle by obstacle, to shatter and destroy, to make the first cracks in the Atlantic Wall. At Pointe du Hoc, 225 US Army Rangers scale a 100-metre high sheer cliff to destroy a German artillery piece that was threatening Utah and Omaha Beach. They're faced with intense resistance, and they fight from trench to trench, pillbox to pillbox, with hand grenades and sidearms to dislodge one German defensive position after another. Their objective achieved, they sit tight as the Germans desperately try and dislodge them. The Germans are in a state of shock. German soldiers had peered out in the morning to see the usually clear English Channel full, the flotilla, the likes of which they had never seen, of thousands, 5,000 ships ready to unload 156,000 troops. They had frantically communicated with their commanders behind the lines in Paris and back in Germany that the invasion was now. The landings were in Normandy. But Hitler did not believe them. He was absolutely convinced that this was a diversion, that the real landings were in Calais, and he would not release the panzer divisions that were so desperately needed to go into action immediately. They were kept in Calais. And because of Allied aerial superiority, the reality is that even if they hadn't been in Calais, they probably wouldn't have actually been able to be deployed anyway. The Germans now knew where the landings were going to be, and they started rallying units from throughout France to head towards the beaches of Normandy. But because of the Allied aerial superiority, they couldn't actually move during the daytime. And as the landings were happening first thing in the morning, it was 12 hours really before the first armoured units could even begin to move towards the Normandy beaches. And this is then further compounded by the fact that Hitler simply refuses to believe that this is the main invasion. When the troops on the beaches communicate with their commanders to tell Hitler, this is it, the day has come, he is asleep. His valet will not wake him. The inflexibility of the German High Command, the confusion that the Allies had sown within the Germans, the ability through air power and paratroopers to disrupt the movement of German reinforcements, buys the troops on the beaches the time they need to knock out one position after another, to establish their beachheads and begin the process of bringing wave after wave of troops, tanks and artillery onto the beach to bring about the critical mass to drive the Germans back. Within a few crucial, confused, bloody hours, the Allies have taken the beaches. They have made it inland. There is much fighting ahead of them. The German army will not give up. For all of its challenges, it's still a highly professional fighting force. There still are crack units of the German army, and in the weeks and months that will come by, the Germans will put up an incredibly determined effort to force the Allies back onto those beaches and back across the Channel. But the D-Day landings had been a success. Through planning, deception, determination, bravery, courage and luck, the Allies had secured a toehold on the very edge of occupied Europe and the beginning of the liberation of Europe. My name is Joseph Parkinson. This has been the debut episode of Ancient to Recent. You can follow us at Ancient to Recent Podcast on Instagram or Ancient to Recent on TikTok or Spotify. You can find all episodes by clicking on the link on Spotify, and also you can listen on YouTube. Leave a comment, a like, a suggestion. Let me know what you thought about the episode, and let me know also about other historical events that you would like me to cover. New episodes will be out every Friday. Thank you so much for listening to the debut episode of Ancient to Recent.